I doubt that. We wanted to welcome everyone today for the program No Cold War Against China. My name is Tracy Holm. I'm a proud member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
And I'm Celia Nibs, and I'm a member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Woo!
Yay. Thank you all for coming today. We're going to have 3 speakers, and then hopefully, time willing, we will be able to do some Q&A at the end. We do have a hard time. We're supposed to be out of the building, so that will dictate some of how long we can go with Q&A.
So yeah, we're in Freedom Road Socialist Organization, also known as FRSO, and we are a national organization of revolutionaries fighting for socialism in the United States. We are Marxist-Leninists who believe in building working class and oppressed nationality movements. We are proletarian internationalists. This means that we support people's movement around the world in the global fight against capitalism and its highest stage, imperialism. And so, during the pandemic for the past several years, we have celebrated the great revolutions of Russia and China, both which happened in October. And as a way to uplift these important events, but also to learn from them. Today's event is so important because of the concentrated effort by the United States government to recreate the Cold War, but this time with China. We have an excellent set of speakers today to talk more about this.
Yeah, you want to introduce me?
And yes, so our first speaker today is Mick Kelly. Mick Kelly is an editor of Fight Back newspaper and a member of the Standing Committee of Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
All right, thank you very much, comrades and friends. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event, Freedom Road, for organizing a really important thing to address a critical topic, the new Cold War on China. It's really one of the greatest and most important issues in the world today, and this Cold War has the possibility of becoming a hot war, as the actions of the United States and an array of hostile Western powers, including Japan, march to Washington, D.C.'s drumbeat. My talk today is going to provide some context and address some of the achievements, the real and concrete achievements of the Chinese Revolution. And a side note here is the content is similar to an essay that I recently wrote commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. It was published by the Contemporary China Publishing House. It's available in Chinese for those of you who read Chinese, but also for those of you who'd like to read it in English, it's on the FRSO website. So I hope you get a chance, check it out. But it provides some historical background, and it also touches on some of the material that I'm going to be covering today to explain how we got to the point that we're at right now. So the Chinese Revolution, led by the Communist Party of China, triumphed in 1949, thus opening the door to a new stage of historical development where the working class, in alliance with the peasantry and other progressive forces, patriotic forces, were able to occupy the commanding heights of Chinese society. Standing on the rostrum in Tiananmen Square in 1949, the outstanding proletarian revolutionary Mao Zedong proclaimed to the world, the Chinese people have stood up, that the days of subjugation and humiliation were over, and a new beginning was underway. And in fact, the old China was over and the new China had begun, and what a difference it was. It was the difference between night and day, backwards and forwards, and in fact between good and evil. And I'd like to take a look at old China. I think part of understanding any journey or how amazing any trip is or any accomplishment, you have to kind of look at the starting point. You can't just say, oh, it was a long journey, but you have to look at where things were begun. And the fact of the matter was that the old China was a nightmare. It was beset by a plague of foreign imperialists, warlords that tore the country up, and a land-owning class of parasites that imposed a nightmare of starvation. It was a society that was unable to save itself and helpless in the face of every adversity. One way to discuss the history of old China, pre-1949 China, is discuss the history of famines. Famines, incidents, periodic incidents of mass starvation. They don't happen in China now, but they used to happen consistently. In old China, there was a feudal class, a class of landlords. They're extremely interested in exploiting people. So they sucked the wealth out of the countryside. They never worked to develop agriculture. All they cared about was making money. So again and again, people starved to death on a large scale. 300,000 here, 5 million here, 1 million here. 1938, 1923, 1943. Again and again in Chinese history going back, you can find a history of famines. It's not accidental. It's the way the system was supposed to work. It was an exploitive and broken system, actually kind of like the broken system that we have in America today. On top of this, exploitive group of parasites, the landlords, then came the foreign imperialists. Yeah, problem of feudalism, landlords, and imperialism, foreign capitalists that beset the Chinese people. And you really can't spend too long talking about their crimes because they can't be covered in a short period of time. But I'm going to hit on some lowlights, highlights, whatever you choose to call them, because it's important, again, for understanding Chinese history and how we got from there to how we got from here. Old China was beset by landlords, as I said, but they hooked up with foreign imperialists. In 1839, the British came to China. They waged a war to sell drugs, so-called opium wars, and that's how they got hold of Hong Kong. They had Hong Kong for about 100 years, actually longer than 100 years, but that's how they got it. They waged a war for drugs. Don't ever talk about, by the way, British or American civilization. It's not reasonable. Gandhi, the famous Indian, was once from India. He was once asked, well, what do you think of, a reporter hit him up on the train and said, Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? Gandhi said, I think it would be a good idea. You know, that's the problem with the British and the Americans in China. I see I have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit. But in any event, yeah, I'm just going to give another example of foreign intervention or imperialist intervention in China, which again I think is important to understanding Chinese history. So in 1900, the United States sent its army to Beijing, along with the British, Germans, actually 8 imperialist powers, for the purpose of opening up China to the Chinese economy. The Chinese people at that time were extremely dissatisfied with Western intervention, and the foreign imperialist powers, including the United States, waged a war. And it was brutal. In Beijing, American troops killed people. They mutilated the bodies of those they encountered. They burned historic buildings, looted art. You actually, every once in a while on the show Antique Roadshow, PBS has it, I don't know if any of you ever watch it, you'll see things that were taken from China in 1900 when the foreign powers went there. It's just something that objectively happened. And just to ponder it for a minute or think about it, imagine if Chinese had come to the United States in 1900 to Washington, D.C., proceeded to burn the place, steal art from the Smithsonian and everything else. I guarantee you, on every talk show in America, people would still be ranting and raving like it happened yesterday. It was a fucking big deal. Pardon me. It was a big deal what took place there. And that's the reality of Chinese history. With socialism, the victory in 1949 was able to change this. It was able to put an end to this period of subjugation by foreign imperialists, landlords, and really open up a new door to prosperity. And I'm just going to stand up because it's actually, my back is bothering me and it's easier for me to speak like this. Am I still visible on camera? Great. So, all right. In old China, do you know how they used to measure horsepower? By what four-legged animals could do. Oxen, horses, donkeys, cows. That's how they used to measure horsepower in old China. Right now, China is the leader in terms of things like electric cars. You want to go see the most advanced rail system in the world? Go to the Shanghai airport. They have a magnetic train. Actually, very few countries can assimilate advanced productive forces like this, but China is able to do that. China is the leader now in world manufacturing. We're talking about a country, again, 1900, Americans were there burning Beijing. The place was starving. 1943, 1 million people dying of famine. Okay, Right now, China is the leader in the world's manufacturing, leader in steel production. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has proved its superiority again and again, and in fact, I think it's superior to the monopoly capitalist system, a declining system that we have right here in the United States. While the U.S., by example, constantly, and I know some of you have been active in the poor people's movement in this country and understand it very clearly, while the U.S. constantly has waged a war on the poor right here at home, People's China is systematically eliminating poverty. In fact, over the past decade, nearly 100 million people, especially in rural areas, have been lifted out of extreme poverty. This is an accomplishment actually unknown in human history. Nothing like this has taken place before this, and this is a victory of Chinese socialism. It's really an example to the world's people. Let me take another example. And again, I realize I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to have to pick it up maybe a little bit or cut some stuff out, but that's all right. Socialist China waged a people's war on COVID-19 and the pandemic, and they brought the crisis under control. In fact, about 5,000 people perished in China. That's it, about 5,000 people. Each day they have about 20 cases where people die in China right now, today. Compare and contrast that to the United States, where the criminal inaction of government, actually willful mishandling of it, demagogic and willful mishandling of it, coupled with the for-profit healthcare system, has killed about 750,000 people. Really, I mean, if that is not an indictment of monopoly capitalism, I don't know what is. What a difference! What a difference between the two stories. Or let's just take another example, which is China's a country of many nationalities. It's a country of many nationalities. And what it does there is it fosters actually equality and national development in respect to those different nationalities. For example, I have some situation. So I traveled in China quite a while ago, and I have some idea of the situation in Tibet. In China, the situation in Tibet was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. It was ruled by a gang of basically slaveholders, where many people had to sell their children into slavery to work in monasteries and then till farms and that kind of thing. China was able to actually liberate Tibet from serfdom, and that was just a wonderful accomplishment. Compare and contrast that to the national oppression, the systematic police terror, etc., that exists in the United States. I think China is actually light years ahead, and socialism is actually vastly superior to capitalism. Critical to, and I'm actually going to have to, where am I at on time here?
You have 3.5 minutes left.
3.5 minutes. Well, I'm going to appeal for a few more minutes. Critical to China's success has been the fact that actually that it has socialism, and that socialism is a very different system than capitalism. For example, in China there are no periodic economic crises. For example, the U.S. has had many, the 30s being the most well-known, the 2008 one being another. Actually, since 1949, every single year, the Chinese economy has expanded. The Chinese economy has grown. It has never contracted once, and it has never experienced an economic crisis. And that's the difference between socialism and capitalism. Socialism is a superior system. I think it was 4 years ago, and I'm wrapping this up now, Chinese President Xi Jinping was summing up the experience, the revolutionary experience of the Chinese people. And he started by saying this: well, in the 20s, the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, it sent the salvos of Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, to our country. And by taking up this science of Marxism-Leninism, the advanced and the working class and the peasants, they were able to take the initiative. They were able to change the course of Chinese history. And that's what I'd like to propose to you that we need to do in this country. We need to take the initiative. We need to build revolutionary organization, and we can have socialism here too. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mick. So we have one more speaker, and then Danny will be our third. Autumn Lake is our next speaker. She's a member of the Minneapolis-based Anti-War Committee, a grassroots organization that has been fighting against imperialism for 23 years. Autumn uses she, her pronouns. Give it up for Autumn.
First,
Yeah, hit the button. There you go.
yeah, first things first, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, first of all, I'm really excited that I was invited to speak here today with, along with both Mick Kelly and Danny Haifong. This is a really awesome experience, and I'm really honored to be able to share this sort of stage with such wonderful and talented and dedicated people fighting for peace and justice. Now, when it comes to the movement for peace and justice, the anti-war movement has sort of had its hands full in the past decade with what seems like a constant cascade of U.S.-backed destabilization and regime change efforts, as well as the expansion of the Israeli apartheid regime. But in the midst of what counts as business as usual for the United States, the U.S. has built a conflict with China that has come to a head in the past few years. In that time, the U.S. has destroyed any semblance of normal relations with the People's Republic of China in favor of escalating conflicts, enacting economic sanctions, engaging in military maneuvers that have the potential to turn this new Cold War into a hot one at a moment's notice. And while this moment in the anti-war movement is certainly unique, the playbook that's being used by the United States at this time is the same playbook that's been using for the past century. So, in order to kind of illustrate how the U.S. is using this playbook in relation to China, I want to first take you through some examples. I want to take you on a tour of a couple other countries around the world that the U.S. has interfered with over the years. So let's start 1998, 1999 in Yugoslavia. So in 1998, 1999, it was claimed that, by the Western press that between 100,000 and 500,000 Albanians were killed by the government of Yugoslavia. This was the pretext that was used by the United States and NATO to start a war with Yugoslavia in 1999. Now, many in the anti-war movement remained steadfast in their opposition to U.S. intervention, but there were others who otherwise would have taken anti-war stances in other conflicts who found themselves supporting intervention in Yugoslavia. And for them, it was supposed to be a clear-cut thing. For them, it was, we stand for peace and justice. Of course, we're going to stand against ethnic cleansing and genocide. The U.S. and NATO bombing campaign that followed destroyed hospitals, churches, nursing homes, and the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Those who resisted the occupation by NATO forces were either jailed or killed. Now, in the aftermath of all of this, UN and NATO investigators scoured Kosovo for months to find evidence of the genocide that the Western press had been claiming for months at this point. They found about 2,000 corpses total. That number was mostly composed of NATO bomb victims as well as Serb civilians killed by the Kosovo Liberation Army. So far from the 500,000 that was claimed by the United States and its allies, it was actually a manufactured incident. It was a manufactured pretext for war. Next on our tour is in Syria. So, for the third presidential administration in a row, the U.S.-led Western intervention in Syria is marching forward at a steady pace. From the initial campaign under the Obama administration to back militant rebels, to the current Secretary of State claiming that we don't intend to lift a single sanction on Syria or change our position to oppose the reconstruction of Syria, it's abundantly clear that the U.S. is not stopping in its intervention efforts in Syria. U.S.-led coalition forces have launched 17,000 airstrikes on Syria, And the U.S. has backed efforts by these Israeli occupying forces to occupy and secure sovereign Syrian territory in the Golan Heights. And of course, the initial justification for this was, yes, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is using chemical weapons against his people. He has to be stopped. And of course, the anti-war movement had this crisis again. Of course, I'm here for human rights. I stand against injustice everywhere. I can't believe that this person would do that. So people who might have otherwise been anti-war found themselves supporting U.S. intervention in Syria. Well, it turns out in 2018, Secretary of State James Mattis admitted that the United States never actually had evidence that the Syrian government was using chemical weapons against its own people. In fact, recently there was a delegation that went to Syria to observe the elections there and found that overwhelmingly the people were in support of Bashar al-Assad, the person supposedly behind the massacres in the first place. They're actually overjoyed. It becomes clear then that the United States will use any type of tension, any type of conflict, any type of trouble, whether real or manufactured, to exert its own political and economic will in wherever it's targeting. And this is especially true when we start looking at China. So when it comes to China, the U.S. has been the Western press especially has focused on certain elements of Chinese society, certain moments of tension, and has exploited those as a way to manufacture consent against the People's Republic of China. For example, in 2018, the Trump administration threw its weight behind the Hong Kong protests, and there are plenty of progressives, leftists, and other human rights types in the United States that saw this and saw, oh, hey, there's people protesting their government over in China. I'm protesting my government here. We're clearly on the same page. We're in the same group. We're in the same movement. However, these protests certainly had the veneer of a movement for justice, but they were actually a pro-colonial and pro-imperialist movement that hailed Donald Trump and the old British Empire as arbiters of freedom. Leaders of that movement regularly met with and had the support of notorious right-wing slime in the United States, including Steve Bannon and Senator Marco Rubio. We would also do well to remember that the spark that ignited this movement, much like its supporters, was antithetical to human rights. In 2018, a Hong Kong college student murdered his 20-year-old pregnant girlfriend while vacationing in Taiwan. And because of Hong Kong law, that person was not able to be extradited to be put on trial for murder. This was the spark that initiated these protests. It was the fact that China wanted to extradite this person. This is what they were rebelling against. Now, in Venezuela, the United States wound up supporting a right-wing politician whose movement was violent, racist, homophobic. The movement was very white and very rich, and often their policies resulted in violence against Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous Venezuelans. Likewise, the movement in Hong Kong the movement in Hong Kong resulted in violence against ethnic minorities living in Hong Kong. The same sort of weight that the U.S. throws behind reactionary movements elsewhere, it threw behind the movement in Hong Kong to increase tensions in China, to destabilize and undermine the government of China, and to build tenuous human rights support here in the U.S. by saying, look, these are people that are protesting for their freedom and for democracy. Don't you care about freedom and democracy? Don't you care about these people's rights? The same thing has taken place with other flashpoints in regards to how the U.S. is building conflict with China. In Xinjiang, for example, this is kind of this will be analogous to our Yugoslavia example. So the accusation there is that the People's Republic of China is putting Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, is committing genocide against this entire ethnic group living in this region in China. Now, of course, the Chinese government maintains that this is a what they're really doing is engaging in an anti-terrorism program, an education and vocational program to curb the sort of rise in terrorist attacks that occurred in the region as a result of influences from neighboring regions. People in the United States, such as Adrian Zenz, who is, first of all, a member of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and is on record as saying extremely deeply homophobic, racist positions, and he believes he's on a God-given mission to take down the People's Republic of China. These are the type of sources that go behind these claims. Now, the Associated Press recently published an article where they claimed that things in China are kind of returning back to normal. In Xinjiang, returning back to normal. They say, we can't really see evidence that a genocide actually happened. They're saying people are out in the street dancing. Uyghur culture is on display everywhere. Previous claims that they're being forced to drink are currently being proven wrong by the fact that several of them are going into liquor stores of their own accord and buying alcohol themselves. Much like the claim in Yugoslavia that 500,000 people were being ethnically cleansed, only for there to be no evidence after the fact, a lot of these news outlets are having to walk back from these massive claims in the wake of no evidence. But the thing is, the damage has already been done. So many people in the United States now already believe that the People's Republic of China is this terrible force here to suppress human rights. Even if they walk back the claims, the damage has been done. It looks like I'm actually up for time, so I'm going to go ahead and concede the mic, but if you have any more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them later.
All right.
And I'd like to introduce our last speaker, Danny Haifong. He is a contributing editor of the Black Agenda Report and a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much to Freedom Road Socialist Organization for having me. Thanks so much to Mick and Autumn. Those were really great remarks, really setting the historical context for this new Cold War against China, and also making an important link between the propaganda that led the United States, or justified the United States' brutal intervention in Yugoslavia with what the United States is doing in relation to China right now. So I really appreciate that. It's a connection that often is not made. So I'm going to try to be brief in my remarks in order to facilitate discussion. But I really want to more so give an overview of what this new Cold War is and what are some of its components in its totality. And I've been sort of obsessed with this question, this new Cold War on China that the United States is leading, in large part because I was lucky enough before the pandemic, right as coronavirus, as it was known then, began to spread. I actually spent 2.5 weeks in China traveling across the country. I was able to travel on about 1,200 kilometers, a little bit more than that, on a couple of different high-speed rail. China is a leader in high-speed rail now in the world. It is the world leader in that realm of infrastructure, 5G technology. We can go on and on. Artificial intelligence. China has made immense advancements over the past several decades. I was able to see the progress in relation to renewable energy, learn about the special laws that the central government and local governments have in place to incentivize and subsidize things like electric cars. Hold on one second. I just want to make sure that I'm not getting... Okay, good. So I was able to see all of this amid this, what was a burgeoning new Cold War at the time. It definitely escalated over the course of this COVID-19 pandemic disaster that the United States has really facilitated. And at that point, it was about December, January 2019 into the beginning of 2020. These talking points that Autumn and Mick kind of brought up, they were just beginning in a lot of ways. A lot of this build-up to the new Cold War happened more so in stealth, beginning with the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, which has massively transferred military weaponry and assets to the Asia Pacific. But I want to talk about this new Cold War as what I think it really is, which is an expression of a flailing US-led imperialist world order, which finds itself actually and objectively increasingly threatened by a stable and socialist China. And I want to emphasize this. The threat for working class people, whether we're talking about working class people in the United States or anywhere else in the world, is imaginary when it comes to China. China isn't waging endless wars, it isn't privatizing essential public services, it isn't imposing brutal levels of debt, and it isn't driving down wages and living standards of the working class. Contrary to the fact wages in China have grown at a pace of 6 to 10% per year over this reform and opening up period. But it is for this reason that China is not a participant in the great race to the bottom, which really renders it a threat to US imperialism. So this new Cold War, what it really is it's a policy arm, a real policy lever of the overall defense doctrine of the United States at this time, which is great power competition. That was the Trump DOD's national security strategy starting in 2017, and that has continued to be adopted by Joe Biden. And so, we can go over sort of a brief summary of what the new Cold War is. Some call this war a hybrid war because it has so many components and it comes from so many different directions. Autumn brought up a lot of the key points on the propaganda war aspect of this new Cold War, but there are so many policy manifestations that this propaganda war really justifies. And we can begin with the economic war. So beginning around 2018, we saw that the Trump administration instituted a hugely counterproductive trade war. And this trade war mainly harmed US corporations and investors. And so much so to the point where many US investors have merely ignored this edict by the United States to impose tariffs on certain exports and imports that relate to US-China bilateral economic activity. And the Biden administration hasn't signaled overtly, hasn't really made any clear indication that he plans on overturning the trade war. His trade representative, Catherine Tai, had discussions with the Chinese envoy recently, within the last few weeks, but even she was remiss to deny that the United States was thinking about going through with what's called phase 2 of the trade war, which would target China's state-owned institutions. These institutions own the commanding heights of China's economy, and to target those with tariffs will have global ripple effects because these are the institutions that really help institute economic development for China, even abroad. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is a huge part of this. So a lot of the US's so-called allies might be angered or might find themselves in a very difficult position, whether we're talking about Japan, India, the Quad, for example, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. They might find themselves in a very difficult spot when or if the United States continues along this trade war, because it will surely hurt the economic prospects for these countries. So we also have to talk about the sanctions, because although China's, unlike Syria, as Autumn mentioned, unlike other countries like Cuba, which are in a much more dire economic situation, China is still the target of US sanctions. And the United States has in particular targeted China's high-tech industries. China's high-tech development is now well beyond where the United States is in very key areas, as I mentioned before: 5G technology, communications, artificial intelligence, and Huawei, which is one of the major producers of 5G and now soon to be 6G technology. Huawei has remained under sanctions since the Donald Trump administration, and Biden has actually escalated these. Now, for 3 years, up until this month, the United States had put under house arrest Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou in Canada for supposedly coercing corporations, Canadian and Western corporations, into basically getting around US sanctions on Iran. And so she was placed under a fraudulent house arrest, placed there for 3 years, and finally she was freed earlier this month. And that was an immense victory for China, and it was an immense victory for the peace movement overall, especially for all those folks in Canada in the anti-war movement who put in a lot of work around that campaign. So sanctions are a big part of this, because it really is all about trying to arrest China's development. Huawei is one of the major producers of high technology, and the United States wants to see Huawei not just collapse, but it wants to see the entire Chinese economy collapse under pressure from the United States. However, this is really a losing game, and it really hasn't produced the results that I think the United States have wanted, which is why we see now a bit more of a contradictory, or what I call a paradoxical approach to China, which I will get to at the end of this talk. So we also have to talk about the diplomatic war. So in the new Cold War against China, we've seen since, especially under Donald Trump, that the US has employed what it calls targeted sanctions, which really is just a euphemism. It's a lie. There's no such thing as targeted sanctions. But under Donald Trump and into the Joe Biden administration, we've seen the United States level sanctions on the Communist Party of China. There are several different kinds of sanctions. There are just sanctions on things like so-called patent theft and espionage, and then there are sanctions on what Autumn referenced in relation to these so-called claims on human rights. So at this time, a party, the Communist Party of China, which has over 90 million members, is currently under sanctions from the United States. And this has, of course, huge ripple effects politically and has really soured relations. We saw last year during the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw what happened in Houston with the ugly closure of the Houston Chinese consulate. And we saw some of our anarchist friends, or what I call Asian provocateurs, disguised as leftists, project really ugly things on the Chinese consulate in LA with messages like tanky, fuck off, fuck Trump, fuck CCP, Black Lives Matter. We saw, pardon my language, but that, I think that just indicates the massive levels of confusion that this new Cold War has really brought about amongst our friends of different political tendencies on the left. So we must move on to the military aspect of this, because it is a huge one. Taiwan was mentioned earlier. Right now, there have been recent reports that the U.S. had sent for over the last year special forces into Taiwan to train its military against a so-called Asian. The United States, ever since the Trump administration, has been pushing a recognition of the separatist local government there, which believes itself to be supposedly a Western democratic society, but Tsai Ing-wen, who's leader of the Democratic arms deals from the United States, upwards of over $2 billion, $750 million so far from the Biden administration, And this is just one aspect of the militarization of the region, the militarization of the Asia Pacific against China, which is so dangerous and which does really pose the threat of a potential hot war with China, which would be disastrous for all of humanity. So Taiwan is one flashpoint here, and the United States is playing a dangerous game because Taiwan has a long history of being colonized, and Taiwan has a long history of being used as a colonial flashpoint to try to undermine and weaken China, from the Dutch all the way back hundreds of years ago to Japan for more than 50 years, and since the United States beginning in the 1950s when it tried to use Taiwan in the so-called ROC, Republic of China government, as a tool to diplomatically and economically isolate China and threaten nuclear warfare against China. So there's a long history beginning back to the first Cold War with regards to Taiwan, but we also have to talk about the militarization and occupation of Okinawa, Guam, Hawaii, the Marshall Islands, Korea, Japan. We're talking about 400 military bases, hundreds of thousands of US troops, thousands of spy planes flying over the South China Sea. We're talking about what really is a dangerous military provocation. So Autumn brought up a lot about the propaganda war, so I won't go too much into this. But I think that there is a real nexus and relationship between the US Department of State with these think tanks like the World Uyghur Congress, with this so-called separatist movement in Hong Kong, which is also backed by major National Endowment for Democracy think tanks, and also even reactionary. We know this in the United States, that there are plenty of organizations and forces that pose themselves as progressive movements, but really serve as astroturf organizations for capitalism. In Hong Kong, you have a whole trade union federation, which was just disbanded, and that's an immense victory since the national security law was put into place. But the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions has been, it's mainly a middle class represented so-called trade union, as opposed to the Hong Kong Federation of Trade Unions in Hong Kong, which has taken National Endowment for Democracy money and which basically spearheads this very right-wing movement to basically put Hong Kong back into the vice grip of imperialism and colonialism. And so we've seen real legislation come out of this astroturf propaganda war. We've seen how the Human Rights and Democracy Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, basically championed by people like Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong, all of these forces now essentially isolated and suppressed and defeated. Again, a huge victory over the last couple of years alone. But this act is still on the books. And what this act did when it was passed under Trump, supported by Nancy Pelosi, supported by Marco Rubio, bipartisan consensus, this act basically said that not only would the U.S. president have to every year consider whether to place sanctions on Hong Kong if it wasn't democratic enough, but also Hong Kong must be sanctioned if it violated U.S. sanctions on the DPRK and Iran. This is how interconnected and how global this new Cold War on China is. It isn't merely just about containing China, but rather ensuring that the containment of China also serves the entire agenda of U.S. imperialism. And so, of course, the propaganda war extends into this so-called colonizer trope that China has been leveled with in Africa and Latin America. But the truth, of course, is quite the opposite. China represents just a teeny tiny share of overall debt on the African continent. Chinese lenders are actually the ones that have to be flexible because they're not actually wedded into a relationship of dependency. African countries do not depend on Chinese lenders. Actually, the dependency lies with the IMF and the World Bank, which actually levels brutal conditionalities in order to gain loan arrangements and financial investments. And the same goes for Latin America, where progressive governments have lauded China for its friendship over and over and over again. So I want to just close by, we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, the racism that has emerged from that. We've seen how xenophobic things have become. Public opinion against China is at public opinion of China is at an all-time low in the United States and the Western world. You have more than half of people polling believing that China needs to give reparations to the world for COVID-19. You even have now a new poll, although I think this poll is bogus, that says that more than half of people would support the United States in an intervention in Taiwan if China invades. How China could invade its own province, that's another question. But there is this shift I want to get to while I close. It's Biden is shifting, and we need to be we need to pay real close attention to this. Biden is shifting to a smart war approach against China. So during the Trump administration, we could characterize it as Obama characterized Bush's wars, a dumb war. They were dumb wars, right? That's how Obama campaigned. That's how he came to be known as some sort of anti-war candidate, when in fact he really, and those who were backing him, just wanted to shift the form in which these wars took. And I think the same thing is actually going on right now under the Biden administration. And this time, there really isn't any commitment to any major shift in policy. So we've seen multiple channels of dialogue open up since the release of Meng Wanzhou. We've seen, as I mentioned before the Chinese envoy and trade representative of the United States, Catherine Tai, speaking. We've seen Jake Sullivan after an embarrassing meeting in Anchorage, Alaska in March 2021. We saw a much more cordial meeting in Zurich in Switzerland this month, which both parties, China and the United States, said went very well. And we know that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping are set to talk supposedly before the end of this year. But at the same time as this is happening, we also had the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, close up shop, its so-called mission centers dedicated to the DPRK and Iran. And now it is dedicating all of its time to China and has admitted that the reason it must do this is because China is basically spy-proof. This is an amazing achievement on the one hand, that China has advanced beyond the United States to the point where the CIA can't get its dirty hands on it. But on the other hand, it's a dangerous shift that shows just how committed, no matter who is the US president, no matter who is in power on either party, how committed the establishment is to waging this war. And so I have 1 minute left, and I just want to say that we need to pay close attention to this, because while these channels of dialogue are being opened, at the same time there's saber rattling over Taiwan. The propaganda war, as Autumn brought up, has been retracted in some ways in regards to Xinjiang and the so-called Uyghur genocide issue, but the propaganda remains overall the same. And the environment, this political atmosphere, environment of anti-China sentiment, this drive to a new Cold War, this multifaceted Cold War continues. And Joe Biden has expressed a deep commitment to this, and has recently expressed a commitment to, to ensuring that the United States remains a militarist power, and one that is wholly committed to overthrowing Chinese socialism. So thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to more discussion.
We'll invite our other speakers up, and we'll do probably about 20, 25 minutes of questions. See if we can kind of place this camera in front of me. So, we are going to ask the people to raise hands, be respectful. We are not interested in hearing any anti-Asian sentiment that's unacceptable in this space, and so I'm just going to say that up front. But please do ask questions. We want to help develop this conversation. Go ahead.
Some of us in the audience have done some climate change work, and something that we get conflicting reports about is the role of China in fighting climate change. And Danny talked a little bit about that. I was hoping that he could expound on that topic more, about the role that China plays in promoting progressive environmental policy.
Danny, did you hear that? All right, so maybe I can try and sum it up and you can tell me if I'm missing anything. We'd like to hear a little bit more about China's policies around combating climate change.
Okay, yeah. Hold on one second. I'm just gonna put on headphones because I think it'll make it easier for me to hear everyone. Okay, China's policies on combating climate change. This is a really good question. I won't take too long, but I did, look some of this stuff up yesterday to give some context. So China's often talked about as a polluter, right? And, overall, China's, does emit the most emissions just in the aggregate, but per capita, actually, the United States emits 6 times more carbon emissions than China, and that is actually a much more critical number when we just talk about how wasteful capitalism is and how a country of 1.4 billion people that had really a requirement to develop its economy had to take the path that existed. And now China is deeply committed, it has been for several years, especially over the last 10 years, in ramping up its fight against climate change. By 2060, it has dedicated itself to being a zero carbon emitter, and to being climate carbon neutral. And this has already been seen, and this goal is very realistic given the fact that carbon emissions per unit of GDP has decreased by 18.2% in 2020, as of 2020, compared to 2015. China is really a leader in renewable energy. I mean, it is the biggest producer and consumer of renewable energy. I mean, when I was there, it's everywhere. I mean, you can't go, unlike the United States, where you can go for a long time without seeing anything like a solar panel or electric vehicle or wind energy. You can't go anywhere in China without seeing this, no matter if you're in the rural area or the urban areas. Since 2010, sales of new energy cars, mainly electric vehicles, are about 55% of the global figure in China. So China is by far the biggest consumer of these vehicles, and you can see it when you're there. I mean, you cannot hear, it's incredible actually. You can barely hear vehicles in the streets because electric vehicles actually tend to be very quiet. And so we learned about how, like in Beijing, there's actually a ban on diesel cars. You cannot buy a diesel car anymore, and that ban has been in place for several years. And even in Shanghai, where things are a little more so-called liberalized, even there, if you're going to get a diesel car, you have to have at least one electric vehicle, and you're going to pay the price of 2 cars to get that diesel vehicle. So these are just some of the ways that China has attempted to curb emissions. One thing that's also really interesting about China is how advanced it is in things like reforestation, for example. So despite all of the urbanization and all of the industrialization that has occurred in China, actually China accounts for 25% of all new green space in the entire planet from 2000 to 2017. And it ranks first in the world in its contribution to greening the environment. It is also committed to protecting aquatic life. It instituted a 10-year fishing ban in the Yangtze River to provide space for potentially endangered species there to resurface again. And this has been a policy actually throughout the country to target this issue of wildlife, which has actually paid a lot of dividends. Those are just some of the policies that China has implemented in regards to the environment, which are very important. And, we see how the United States has responded, not well. I mean, right now, to this day, the United States has sanctions on Xinjiang province, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, for so-called human rights, but they have actually targeted renewable energy producers there of solar panels, because the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region happens to be the principal place where solar panels globally are produced. And so the US is actually hampering our ability to replace dirty energy with more clean energy through this new Cold War.
Thank you, Danny. Other questions? Well, I'll ask one quick. Maybe Danny or other speakers, if you wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do here, what our role is in the United States. Autumn's ready, so we'll go Autumn, or maybe Autumn and Danny if you want to answer too.
Yeah, I think there's am I on?
Yeah.
Right. I think there's a couple of ways to approach the question. What should we do in the United States? I mean, obviously, on a very basic level, we should oppose war moves towards China and be in solidarity with the Chinese people and government. I think that's a very basic thing. I think that China also poses some questions for us. What kind of society do we want to have? Where are we going with all this? Do we want to continue to live the way that we're living? And I think the system they're building in China, a system where workers have political power, is frankly, it's superior to the capitalist system that we have in the United States. And I think that's a question that people should consider. And on the question, just if I can, on what I consider to be an important question, and that is the question of Taiwan. The question of Taiwan is the great unfinished piece of business of the Chinese Revolution. China had a civil war where the reactionaries headed by Chiang Kai-shek were supported by the United States. They lost and they fled to Taiwan. And that's where they've been hiding out with the Americans' help ever since. China has a right to reunify its country. China's been very clear that it wishes to do this by peaceful means. But patience goes so long, and the United States is supporting separatists there. There can be no question of self-determination for Taiwan. Taiwan is a part of China. It's a province of China. And the idea that the Americans are going to cut it off or a bunch of Westerners are going to take it away, that ain't going to happen. So I think, again, we need, as progressive and revolutionary people in the U.S., we need to be clear about that. Anyway.
Can everyone hear me okay? So, when it comes to, what we can do here in the United States, right? So, obviously, having a robust anti-war movement is critical, but, the thing that we need to keep in mind is that the United States doesn't have any noble goals when it comes to pursuing this conflict. In 2015, Robert Daley, the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, don't laugh, stated that even if China were to change, even if they were to adapt our constitution and our laws wholesale, we should still try to limit their development purely because we shouldn't have a peer competitor. We must stop them even if it means we have to push them back into poverty. This is U.S. think tanks that have informed the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the current Biden administration. The goal is to bring China under control, even at the cost of the people of China. So as people dedicated to peace and justice, regardless of what the U.S. has to say about China, know that its goal will result in the destruction of lives and livelihoods of over 1 billion people. If you take nothing else from this, you already know not to trust what the United States has to say about black life and police terror. You already know not to trust what the United States has to say about immigrant justice when it has its own concentration camps on the border. You already know not to trust what the United States has to say about alleviating poverty when 3 million people are facing eviction because the U.S. won't provide COVID relief. You know better than to trust them when it comes to these subjects. You should know better than to trust them when they say they have the interests of the people of China in mind.
Yeah, no, thank you, both Mick and Anna. Those are really good points. I co-founded the No Cold War campaign and also now co-edit Friends of Socialist China, which is a platform that tends to aggregate and also create original content, journalistic content of all forms in relation to China. And I think one of the things that I am very committed to, and I think we can all do, whether it's in our organizations or it is in our own individual work, is to counter the propaganda war against China. Because while we can, of course, oppose the new Cold War on the principle of how the anti-war movement generally does in the United States, which is just advocating against U.S. intervention, we are very clear, and I think everyone here is very clear, that the new Cold War in China is not merely just an act of aggression meant to expand U.S. hegemony. That is surely a goal that remains at its core. But this new Cold War is also a war on socialism. And we have to be unafraid of saying that, because in this climate where the United States' population is being primed, especially the white American population is being primed to support bellicosity towards China, it makes it even more important that we emphasize and uphold this element, this principal contradiction in this new Cold War, which is the war on socialism redux, where just like the old Cold War, when there was an outward war on socialism led by the United States is attempting to do this again because the writing is on the wall. The United States is an imperialist empire in decline, and the entire imperialist world system is going to go down with it. The path has already been set. We have lived through 18 months of hell. We've lived through 30 plus years of neoliberal economic hell. And the world has lived over more than 3 decades of U.S. unipolar hegemony. And the entire planet is really shifting away from this, or is attempting to, but is being restrained by the violence and vice grip of imperialism. And China is offering a different path, objectively. And with projects like the Belt and Road Initiative and all of the various arrangements internationally that China is leading on a more mutual basis, we really do have a duty to counter the propaganda so that these projects can be as successful as possible. Because as Lenin said, our real task here is to fight our government, to make sure that our government is incapable of doing what it really wants to do. As Autumn said, the plan is to ensure that China is both weak and eventually no longer a socialist country. And that's been the goal since 1949, but now the stakes are even that much more high.
In the back corner over there.
Speaking of poverty, how did China get people out of poverty? How long did it take, and why is the U.S. So how did they get people out? How long did it take? What are the measures, and why is the U.S. not raising this effort?
Nick, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, China's war on poverty has been a protracted process that's been going on since 1949. And it is something completely different that exists in the U.S. because the Chinese government actually serves the Chinese people. In fact, the Chinese people are in charge, which allows them to systematically solve their own problems. To end poverty in China essentially involved solving the land question. China was dominated by landlords. 90% of the people lived in the countryside, and the land question needed to be solved. Systematically, step by step, the peasantry was able to improve its standard of living. That process took off greatly in 1978, and it's accelerated ever since then. Now, when China says it's ended extreme poverty, it doesn't mean that everybody is rich or well off or something like that. No, China still has a way to go and way to develop. But what it's done again is created a system where you basically work and you can improve yourself, and that the surplus goes to enrich society as a whole instead of some rich bastards sitting at the top. And it's a very different thing than what exists in America today.
There's one part of your question I want to take a stab at, which is, why doesn't the United States kind of praise the efforts to eliminate poverty in China? One thing I want to point out is that it's not just in China. If you look at a lot of the targets of U.S. imperialism, throughout the years, one thing you'll find in common is that their governments kind of undergo efforts to improve the lives of their people. For example, I'll bring up Venezuela again. The current government in Venezuela is kind of known for doing a lot of affordable housing projects, ending homelessness, guaranteeing food staples for its people. And of course, this was one of the countries in the past few years that was most viciously attacked by U.S. imperialism. You see, for a country to provide for its own people and to actually kind of invest in these social safety nets, these social programs, they then cannot kind of enrich the ruling class of their society, and by extension the ruling class of the United States. That money going directly towards people's needs means it's not going to the pockets of capitalists. This is the case in Venezuela, it is the case in China. It is something that the U.S. wants to end because they have their own ruling class whose pockets they need to line. Another interesting case actually we saw was in Iraq, where, of course, we had a while where the United States was saying that Saddam Hussein was an evil piece of shit and that he needs to be taken down. Now, in the early days of Saddam Hussein's rule in Iraq, the United States liked him just fine. Didn't actually really seem to have a problem with him, even if he did, some things that we wouldn't consider very good things to do. But once the government of Iraq actually started investing in social programs, started kind of using those oil profits to invest in social safety nets and social programs, that's when the United States started to have a problem. That's when the war in Iraq really got underway. So it's not just the reason that the United States doesn't praise poverty elimination efforts in China is the same reason it didn't praise them in Iraq or Venezuela or any other country that's attempted it. It is antithetical to the interests of the U.S. ruling class to have poverty be eliminated.
Yeah, and I'll just add, because I've done some research and study on China's particular experience with alleviating and eliminating extreme poverty, and I think it reflects the difference between Communist Party leadership to have a Communist Party that has political power to serve the people versus here in the United States, which claims itself to be a democracy, but really just a democracy for the rich, where the rich's interests are expressed. China spent, several trillion yuan, RMB, in the last 10 years alone, in order to get the last 99 million people who are living under the World Bank's marker for absolute poverty out of absolute poverty. And there have been detractors who said, oh, well, the World Bank's marker is so low, but China actually uses a different marker as well, which is to a much larger degree higher, and counts things like the 2 assurances and 3 guarantees, like housing, education, healthcare, and access to food and clothing. So this poverty alleviation campaign is very extensive and has been very extensive and continues on. And with the investment of several trillion RMB, what we saw also was a deep commitment among millions of Communist Party cadre sent to the villages, sent to some of the most difficult terrains in regions of China to help villagers, to help poor people shake off the scourge of poverty. And actually 1,800 Communist Party members died in this fight. So it was a real war on poverty where there were immense sacrifices made. And so this is such an incredible victory that the United States could never praise, because it would open, I always say this, it would open a can of worms, because the United States is actually increasing the levels of extreme poverty in the United States. It's increasing the number of people at risk or already living on the streets. It's increasing the number of children and families who are hungry. It's increasing the number of people who are worried about whether they can see a doctor if they get sick. I mean, this is the scenario that we are living under, where we have societies really on divergent paths, and that's what the Poverty Alleviation Campaign demonstrates. And China is going to continue onto this path to ensure not only extreme poverty is eliminated, but also poverty in general. And that, I think, will really continue to garner the ire of the United States' empire, because it will show an example to the global South, which is what the United States is really worried about. It will show an example to the global South through things like the Belt and Road Initiative that actually another economic situation is possible, one that isn't characterized by cruel and unusual forms of debt and extreme poverty.
You mentioned that the United States is kind of pivoting to smart wars after Bush destroyed Iraq. Obama pivoted to smart wars in Libya, Syria, Venezuela, and you're saying that Biden's kind of trying to do that same kind of pivot. Do any of the panelists see particular arenas where Biden's going to try to cause provocations? In the DPRK, obviously around Taiwan, but in South China Sea, but other areas.
Danny, do you want to start us off this time? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question. Could somebody paraphrase it maybe?
So the question is about smart wars, and if you see any provocations coming down the line, in particular around the DPRK, Taiwan, things like that. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Well, okay, sure. I think it's difficult to predict whether there will be a specific escalation. I think that it's certainly possible. The problem here is that the United States is in a much bigger conundrum than I think it has been in when it comes to achieving these kind of objectives. Because as Mick said with Taiwan, I mean, China has every right, and it's actually internationally recognized. And China is no small player, right? The United States sees itself as the big bully around the world, and so when it's Iraq or Afghanistan or even Venezuela, it feels like it can throw its weight around. But with China so close to becoming the #1 economy in the world, so integrated, and this is also the beauty and what some unfortunate forces on the so-called left have misconstrued. This idea that just because China is a part of the world market economy, just because under a global capitalist economy that China participates in this, that this somehow makes it an enemy of socialism. It's preposterous, because it's actually the fact that it has been able to advance the productive forces to this point, that is so integrated in the world economy that a rupture like military confrontation would spell economic catastrophe for the United States, the Western world, and surely for the entire world. So it's hard to predict how far the United States can go. The United States really is right now, and I'm writing about this for next week, it's really in a situation where it is this highest form of a paper tiger, as Mao called imperialism several decades ago. That's the situation the United States is in. Taiwan, it really has no legal authority over Taiwan, no matter how much it says. Even all this stuff about the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. All October we've heard China is flying planes, its aircraft is interfering in Taiwan's ADIZ. The United States created the ADIZ in Taiwan in 1950 in order to essentially assert its military dominance in that region. And it's not legally recognized by the United Nations, by any, by any international body with any sort of legitimacy. So it's hard to predict. I do think that it's very possible that the United States will, I think it's almost guaranteed, that it will attempt in every flashpoint to advance its interests in whatever way is possible. So whether that means that it continues the trade war and Biden kind of bides his time, ironically, he tries to bide his time and get to a second term where kind of gloves can maybe come more off. It's very possible that we'll see a sort of stagnation in China policy, but advances anywhere else. We know that the DPRK, that Biden has taken even a more right-wing turn with the DPRK as opposed to even Trump's so-called attempts at fostering some kind of dialogue, which really was the effort of DPRK in South Korea to facilitate. But in any event, we have to just pay very close attention. And I think that because the wars are happening right now, because sanctions are wars, so sanctions on DPRK, Iran, Syria, anywhere, that's a form of war. Sanctions against China's tech industry, that's a form of war. Sending warships through the Taiwan Strait, through the South China Sea, that's a form of war. I think all of this must be opposed and must be highlighted as a military aggression and imperialist aggression, so that it is not up to the imperialists to decide when is the correct moment, if there is one, to escalate. And I think that's really the task at hand.
There's actually one thing I kind of want to piggyback off of what Danny said, in terms of like the risk of rupture to the kind of world economy that comes with the United States kind of escalating things with China, is that with China's kind of growing diplomatic, political, and economic ties with other countries, including things like the Belt and Road Initiative, you actually have it such that countries that previously would exclusively turn to the United States for certain things like, your development loans, aid, etc., are turning to China instead. You actually even have European countries now that are actually preferring doing work with China to doing work with the United States. So the U.S., I think, has to tread very carefully, because it is very quickly losing all of the allies it had to the kind of gradual change in sort of the dynamics that exist between like the U.S. and the rest of the world, and China and the rest of the world. So if Biden is biding his time, then maybe they won't act too rashly and destroy any sort of safety net they have with the rest of the world, but it doesn't seem likely.
Yeah, just three quick points. I think Malcolm X once said that if a man is walking around your neighborhood threatening to kill you, you have to take this person seriously. And the United States has identified China as the principal strategic competitor, if you will. And if you look at Defense Department documents, spending patterns, you see that a lot of this stuff is more aircraft carriers, more sea power, more things that you would need for a war with China. And they openly talk about it. I have the fortune or misfortune of reading a lot of foreign policy journals. For example, the last 4 issues of Foreign Affairs, I think every single one has had scenarios for fighting a war over Taiwan. Actually more than one. So this is what, in terms of ruling class policy, foreign policy circles, these are the kinds of questions they're discussing. That's point one. Point two, I think that Taiwan really is the principal flashpoint, and the U.S. is going to have to make a decision about its policy of strategic ambiguity, where the U.S. is unclear about whether it's going to do armed intervention or not on the issue of Taiwan. I think the U.S. is probably going to have to clarify that. And finally, there's a set of corollary questions that affect those of us who are interested in the issue of U.S. intervention. For example, there's a revolution taking place in the Philippines right now. And the Filipino people are trying to cast off the yoke of American imperialism, really, and domestic reactionaries. And at this point, the Philippines assumes a bigger and bigger role for the U.S. as a point of projection of power into Asia, particularly towards China. So I think we can expect more U.S. intervention, for example, in the Philippines as a result of the hostility towards China.
Thank you. So we're close to time, but we do have 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask all of you to help us clean up at the end to make it possible. So I would rather continue with questions, at least for these last 2. So come on, the gentleman in blue first.
Yeah. Any graphs that I've seen have shown that the GDP per capita and the caloric intake per capita of China skyrocketed during the 80s and 90s. So I was wondering what change in socialist policy in China brought that, or if like the graphs are wrong.
So, Mick, do you want to answer first? Maybe you could repeat it for Danny. I'm guessing that one didn't get picked up.
Okay, so as I understand it, basically people's nutritional needs were addressed much greater in the 80s and 90s. Caloric intake is what you're saying, but basically people had better nutrition and that kind of thing.
That seems to be the case.
Yeah.
That seems very different from the 3 decades before.
Well, it actually is the case. And one thing that's interesting about China, as opposed to the United States, is that every year in China, life expectancy goes up. And in recent years, every year, the life expectancy goes down. And that's actually one of the most interesting, in terms of societal development or the health or welfare of a society, I think that's an important point. That said, that China did have a rapid expansion of its economy starting in 1978. And what I would say about that is, in the period prior to that, a firm foundation was being built in industry and in agriculture. And from that foundation, the reforms that took place starting in 78, then another set of them in 1982, allowed for the rapid development of the countryside. Cities too, but particularly the countryside. Yeah, there's a lot more food around, and some of it was using market mechanisms. Others of it was through certain kinds of targeted subsidies. But I think China has made truly astounding gains in that period. Hence, I believe the life expectancy in China right now is 77 years. It's almost equal to the U.S., which again, considering where China was, where you had people dying in their teens and 20s, I mean, it's really, again, a remarkable achievement.
Danny, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, a little still unclear about the question, something about nutrition. I'll just say that, I'll echo Mick's points about, just general conditions for people have improved to the point where life expectancy goes up each year. When I was there are, people do talk about, because of how fast things have developed, there are issues that arise through development, especially in relation to quality of food and the differences. That there is now an abundant, people are, China, there is no real hunger, but now there is this kind of talk about, well, how do we ensure quality? And I think that's going to be an ongoing struggle. And I think, it's going to be part of this ongoing anti-corruption campaign that's happening in China, right? There is this enduring recognition of class struggle in China. Class struggle hasn't ended because it's a socialist society. Actually, now that the productive forces have been advanced to this point, that class struggle actually takes a kind of new significance, because it is about how do, as Xi Jinping recently declared, how do you ensure common prosperity? And we're seeing this across all of China's so-called private sector, where there is a move to put in quality control measures so that development for development's sake also includes the people's sake as well. And I think this is a really important development, and one that will impact all sectors of society, all aspects of living in China. And I think that there's a lot of hope there, a lot of confidence in China, both in their society and the direction that they're going in.
And yeah, to one more question. You in the black shirt right there?
Yes. Beginning in 1989 and 1990, it seems the U.S. subscribed to this end of history thesis that Western liberal capitalism was on the march, and that by incorporating China into the WTO, building trade ties, permanent normal trade relations, it could first subsume and then incorporate China into its hegemonic order. So why did American policymakers not realize that the PRC's growth would eventually undermine the hegemonic order instead?
I can go. Yeah.
Danny, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just. Well, I think there can be, I think, a big misunderstanding among people because we in the United, especially our generation, those of us who have grown up in the post-Soviet era. I was born in 1990. There can be amongst people, working people, this idea that capitalism is the only game in town. Capitalism is kind of all-consuming. It is dominant, and it has, even if it has all these problems, it has no weaknesses. Well, I think this period, the last 2 generations of human existence have shown that not only are there problems associated with capitalism, but there are immense limitations and weaknesses. And one of which is what we as communists always talk about, is that capitalism actually does dig its own grave. So capitalism produces the conditions from which it buries itself under, and it buries itself under with the tools that the working class uses to build socialism. And so the war on socialism, right, that had some successes during the First Cold War, now has reached a point where the United States, even during this war on terror period, this period leading up to the war on terror, where they were trying to integrate the wild 90s, China was supposedly more friendly to the market. There was all these misinterpretations and I think wild exaggerations about China's development model and its socialist path that led to what I think ultimately was all about just narrow interests among the capitalist class, because the capitalist class has very narrow interests. They thought, okay, China, we can make all this profit from China. Look at this immense low-wage labor force, and we might have the added benefit of toppling its government and making it into a liberal, so-called capitalist democracy. That was a miscalculation. That was never going to happen. There was never any indications that that was even in the cards, but it was really the only thing that the world capitalist system could do in relation to China. Because China was not going the path of the Soviet Union. It was attempting to learn from some of those errors, but also attempting to just build its own path. And because of its integral role in the entire, in this sort of world economy, the United States had no choice but to basically lay the basis for what now is this burgeoning conflict that the United States is leading towards China in order to try to arrest China's development. So I think it's such an important thing that you raise, but it just shows how capitalism is not, it may be dominant, but it is not invincible. And actually right now, everything is pointing to capitalism being in a general crisis that it certainly has no capacity to get out of.
So I would like to add on to that a little bit. First of all, as someone who was born in 1991, I also agree that, first of all, which one of you was laughing, I'm 30 or 40 years old, I don't need this. So a lot of us kind of, like Danny said, are kind of missing the critical context of having lived while a socialist country was kind of the major rival superpower of the United States, and we're starting to see it again. But because we didn't live through it the first time, I think one critical piece of context we're missing is that the kind of attempts at economic encirclement and containment of China actually date all the way back to the revolution in 1949. You can even see examples under the Nixon administration of sort of soft measures of containing China's economy, trying to exploit the cheap labor force, trying to use instead of thinking of outright conflict, thinking, well, maybe we can kind of slightly guide it in the right directions, and I don't want to wind up repeating everything that Danny said, but essentially this sort of softness on the process because of how it benefits, how it had short-term benefits for the capitalist class, led China to develop its productive forces. Now there are actually those on the left who kind of say that this period in China's history was a problem that they were developing their productive forces because they saw it as sort of a betrayal of the revolution. And yet now here we are with the elimination of absolute poverty. This process that China was able to take advantage of, at the expense of the capitalists, actually showed that they were able to make things happen for the good of the fucking people. So I could probably rant about this all day, but I'm actually just gonna go ahead and see if my friend here has anything else to add.
Sure. I think that U.S. policy towards China has undergone some distinct stages. I'll address your point directly. So I'll date myself a little bit too, which is that. So I was in Shanghai in 1975 in front of thousands of young people, deeply inspired by the victory in Vietnam, and looking forward to something similar happening in the U.S. So that's dating myself a bit, but at that time, U.S. foreign policy actually aimed to contain and, if possible, confront and overthrow Chinese socialism. Starting in 1977, 78, 79, U.S. foreign policy changed towards a policy of peaceful evolution, where the idea was basically to encourage the development of reactionary and capitalist forces within China, which the U.S. did, by the way, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, too. With the aim of bringing an end to Chinese socialism. Chinese socialism did have to undergo a number of tests, and I think it still will in the future. There is a capitalist sector of the economy, if you will. There are hostile forces, and the story is never over until it's over. And I think, quite honestly, at this point, China is going in the right direction. It is developing socialism in a vigorous sort of way. And I think it is overcoming the challenges of world capitalism headed by the U.S.
I'm going to close us out here, and I want to thank everyone for coming, but I want to encourage you. I know there are a few faces out here that I don't know. Road Socialist Organization is one of the few organizations in the United States that talks about socialist China and uplifts it, actually, because we are a Marxist-Leninist organization. Many other groups do not do that, and so today we are here because China is a place that we can learn immense things from, but also it's a great place to talk about socialism, right? It's a great place to look at where we can learn, to look at where we want to be, but we don't get from here, from where we are right here in the U.S., to where China is by sitting around and talking about it. So we are a group that is expanding and growing, and we would like people to think about joining us. We have some great brochures at the table, many comrades here to talk to, and I really hope that people think about how we get there, and that's by joining revolutionary groups like Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
And I'd like to just close out by thanking our speakers, Autumn, Vic, and Danny. Thank you so much for speaking. And I'd like to thank Wyatt as well for handling all of the technology. Thank you all for coming, and yes, join FRSO.